Matthew Castle, #1 detective in all of video games. You have been playing the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles.
Yes, so this is a compilation of 2 games that came out on the Nintendo 3DS in Japan about 4 years ago. At the time, there didn't seem to be any attempt to localize them or any word of that they would be ever localized. So we'd kind of written these off as just 2 parts of a series we'd never get to play. One of my favorite series of all time, the Ace Attorney games, which are the famous Capcom lawyer games. They're sort of visual novel adventure games where you play as a lawyer and you investigate crimes, and then you go into a courtroom and you pick apart witness testimony by presenting evidence that reveals contradictions. That's basically the mechanical heart of the game, is presenting clues to prove other people wrong with things. What's different about this is that where Ace Attorney is set in modern day, this is set in Victorian London. You play as one of the ancestors of Phoenix Wright in modern day. You play as Ryunosuke Naruhodo. He's basically Phoenix Wright, but 100 years ago. He's a very similarly nervous young man, but the kind of gimmick here is that you team up with Sherlock Holmes. It's really grounded in the period. So the series creator of Ace Attorney is a guy called Shu Takumi. He is an absolute nut for crime fiction, particularly of this kind of era, the Victorian, sort of very traditional, kind of very logic-driven crime writing. That comes through in this game. There's so many nerdy details. It really goes in about the different things from the time. It really goes in depth about like the technology and the kind of customs of the period, and specifically in how those can be used to do murders and things. So it's not just like a boring history lesson, like it all factors into the crimes, but it's weirdly detailed for something which is quite daft on the surface. Sherlock Holmes, he isn't a lawyer, so he's not really in the court scenes. You work with him in the investigation sections of each case, which kind of happen between the court scenes in these things called dances of deduction, where he kind of highlights what he thinks happened at a crime scene, but he's kind of a bit of an idiot, Sherlock Holmes, so you have to kind of correct him by pointing out like what actually happened. He'll have some preposterous hypothesis. He'll say there was an anti-gravity device, which is why all the furniture's upside down, and then you have to look around the room and work out why is the furniture actually upside down, because it probably isn't an anti-gravity device. So they're more like comic set pieces than very difficult puzzles, but they're quite beautifully done. And then you are in court as Naruhodo and meeting all these really strange kind of witnesses. What I love about this game is how weird the character designs are. They're super rich kind of sort of caricatures. They've got these little like looping animations which are really full of life and kind of convey how strange they are. In classic Ace Attorney fashion, you sort of tend to have a pretty good inkling of like who the villain is, and like a lot of the fun is just trying to kind of like break them down and get to the moment that they finally sort of shatter and reveal their kind of full villainous persona. So it's all the kind of classic Ace Attorney stuff, but kind of wrapped up in this Victorian skin.
Does that work then if you begin the case and you're like, well, I know straight away this person is obviously...
That's sort of part of the series. I mean, they've always likened it in the past to like Columbo, where you know the baddie at the start and the thrill is actually like the pursuit rather than the mystery of who did it. I mean, I'd say a lot of the twists and reveals, it's more about like how they did it. There are a couple of cases in here where it's slightly harder to predict the outcome in terms of who the person's going to be, but most of them have a couple of good twists about the actual like mechanics of the murder.
So yeah, it is more just about, they give you the answer, you figure out how to get there.
Yes, sort of. I mean, you'll have the broad strokes of it, but there's always some weird stuff. A lot of the cases are not like impossible crimes, but there's sort of an impossible element to it. Like a man who is stabbed inside a horse-drawn carriage, and there's only the victim and another man inside who claims to be innocent, for example. And, there's another one about a kind of science experiment which is going to teleport a man a great distance, but when he arrives that distance, he appears to have been murdered, and it's like, does this machine actually work? What actually happened? Where was he murdered? It's that kind of stuff.
Is the main appeal of this game, like the other games, in its characters? And
it's the characters, it's the drama of the thing. It's got absolutely amazing music that that really drives it. The music is a really vital part of the Ace Attorney series because they've got all these different like themes that kick in at different moments. There's the kind of the little investigative theme, and then there's the cross-examining. There's a kind of mystery theme. But when you reveal a contradiction, you reveal someone for a lie, you get like the kind of objection theme, which is where you're kind of pursuing them. And, the guy slams his fist down, this kind of epic tune kind of powers up. And it's got this real charge to it. For something which is relatively linear and like relatively hands-off in terms of like your interaction with it, it's quite minimal. It still kind of has that big Capcom arcade energy. It's like if a courtroom scene was a Street Fighter fight, that's how this would kind of feel. Like two people are yelling at each other and there's fist slams and the music's changing and it's going up in tempo as the kind of case goes on. It works really hard to kind of keep you excited, which, I've always loved about the series. And it's kind of really fun seeing that married to this slightly more contained or like demure historical period. All the instruments are, on the soundtrack, it's all sort of violins and accordions and things, but it still has that kind of arcade kind of energy of the modern games.
Is Herlock Shomes the big new thing in this?
Yeah, I mean, the period is vital to it. It does change kind of the tone of the thing, and the fact that you're this Japanese lawyer, visiting Britain, and there's some tension there with some racist people in Britain, newsflash, who kind of give him grief, and there's some, that's kind of interesting, kind of getting through that. Sherlock Holmes or Herlock Shomes, he definitely livens up the investigation periods, which are traditionally like the drier part of the game. He had some kind of character to them. If you're into Holmes, there's some quite fun like interplay between the cases in this game and some of his famous cases. Like there are cameos from characters in his books. It's sort of set in a world where like Sherlock Holmes has already solved those mysteries and they've been written and published by Watson. People are fans of him. He has a reputation. Like Naruhodo has this sidekick called Sasato she's like a fan of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and there's cases that riff on like Hound of the Baskervilles or the Red-Headed League or the Speckled Band, things like that. Maybe a bit nerdier and a bit more niche than the traditional Ace Attorney, but I would think if you were a fan of those games, as they were kind of based on this crime fiction to begin with, there's enough sort of shared DNA that you'll probably dig it.
Where would you rank this? It's 2 games, isn't it, in total?
Yeah, 2 games put together. I mean, you kind of have to play them as one because there's a lot of like unanswered questions in the first game, and if that was just by itself, that would be quite annoying. But because you get them both, you get all the satisfying kind of reveals in the second game, which, the second game feels a lot bigger and more dramatic because of the relative ambiguities of the first game, I guess. Because it's set back in the past, it's a really good entry point. Like, you don't have to have any prior knowledge. The Ace Attorney games are super tangled and do kind of have to be played in order to make sense. This one can be just played as a complete standalone. I'd rank it pretty highly. It just has like great production values. I love them. I really can't understate like the music and the character animations in this are just really, really fun, and you want to see kind of what mad like bullshit happens next always, which is like a sign of a great Ace Attorney game. One thing I would say is it's massive. It's really, really long. It took me over 60 hours to do both of them, which as a visual novel, like I'll admit, I played it on the Switch, like most of it handheld, sitting on the couch, sitting in bed, where, on trains, here, there, and everywhere. The idea of sitting at a desktop for 60 hours, playing quite a static game, doesn't appeal to me. Like, for me, this will always be a handheld series. That might just be my, like, Nintendo history and bias showing through, but it definitely feels a more natural fit for handheld gaming. This is more cinematic than most visual novels. There's a lot of animation, there's a lot of like camera movement, there's a lot more going on, but even this is still quite static and you're just looking at the text. I mean, I set a lot of the text on kind of auto scroll, so when the text finishes it goes to the next box. So I'm not even pressing buttons for like 95% of this game. I'm just sitting there and sort of watching it, which makes more sense slouched in bed. But I really, really rate it. I mean, if you are an existing fan of Ace Attorney, obviously get it. But for people who have never played one, it's a good place to start. But I would still probably take the Ace Attorney trilogy, which is also on PC, as a better entry. That's the full Phoenix Wright package. This is slightly weirder.